Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another weekly episode of Everything Vaguely Paranormal. As always, I am Blake Smith, and with me are my partners in the paranormal, Miss Shelley Pruitt and Mr. Ryan Roberts. How are y'all doing?
Pretty dang good, man.
Pretty dang good, man.
Pretty dang good. I did the accent this week because you weren't available. So.
I wasn't. No, that's right. It's my turn tonight. So, Shelley, how you doing?
I'm having an undergarment problem, but it'll be fine here in a minute.
Is the underwire sticking you right in your left one? Is that the issue?
Am I right or my left one? It's one of the two. I don't know which.
She ain't got nothing to get poked in. So
shut up, Brian. Oh, is this how we're going to start the show?
I would say, what a way to kick the show off. Yep. Way to kick the show off.
Like you would know.
I don't know.
He would. He's a size B, so it's all good.
These are bigger than mine. You're right.
Hey, they're getting better. Don't be jealous.
God.
Okay.
Well, enough about boobies. Welcome to our, well, I'd say last week of Ferocious Female Month, because it is the last week in May. However, I'll go ahead and give y'all a heads up. I'll spoil it. We are going to extend Ferocious Female Month by one more week because tonight we are covering a very, very in-depth topic. And tonight we're going to be talking about Belle Gunness. If you do not know who that is, she's probably one of America's most, if not the most prolific serial killer, female serial killer. Oh, yeah. So she's got a lot to her. So we're only going to get through half of her story tonight. That's how much there is.
Well, it's a supersized show for a supersized woman. So we had to fit into two
Brian,
different
you are
episodes.
so mean. You are so mean. You are the meanest one of all of us.
She killed so many people.
She did. She really did. She really did. Yes, we're going to end Ferocious Female Month with a, she earned her name. We'll just put it that way. Mm-hmm. We started with Miss Belle Starr, then we went to Miss Lavinia Fisher, and both of those ladies, one had to earn it, or one had to become it, I guess, because of the time she was brought up in. One was accused of it. This one,
and innocent.
Nah. This one, she just straight out earned it. So, with that, I'm going to jump into part one of America's Deadliest Woman, Belle Gunness. I'm not even going to ask y'all how much y'all know about her because I found as much as I could. So,
well, good. Tell me something I don't know.
All right, I'll try. Well, in the early hours of April 28th, 1908, Ella Clifford rose from her bed to begin to prepare breakfast for her husband, Michael. As she stumbled into the kitchen, she gazed out the window and saw the glowing horror unfolding at the neighbor's house. It wasn't a mere lantern light. This was something far more violent. Smoke curled from the roof of the old farmhouse on McClung Road, slow at first, then thick and choking as flames began to consume everything in their path. By the time anyone reached the scene, the house was already collapsing. A man stumbled from the smoke, coughing, barely dressed, and shouting for help. He said others were still inside. He had tried to reach them, but he couldn't. Fearing for their lives and at the behest of his neighbors, he raced to alert the fire department, who would ultimately arrive too late. The house was reduced to embers, its bones charred and splintered, the chimney rising like a gravestone in the smoky dawn. When the flames died and the digging began, the true horror started to emerge. What they found in the ashes would turn a quiet farm on the edge of town into the center of a storm that no one in Leaport, Indiana, could have imagined. It wasn't just the fire that haunted people, but what it was meant to hide. Belle Gunness was not the kind of woman anyone forgot, and after that morning, Leaport and the country never would. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, Leaport, Indiana was the kind of place where life was measured by seasons, not headlines. Church bells kept time more faithfully than clocks, and most days unfolded with predictable rhythm. People tilled the land, raised families, and rested on Sundays with the quiet certainty that their neighbors were doing the same. It was a town built on hard work and the illusion of safety. The houses were simple but well kept, the residents modest but proud. No one locked their doors because no one expected trouble. If misfortune came, it was understood to be God's will, not the product of malice. And if someone disappeared, the question was not what happened, but rather, where did they go? That kind of thinking left wide spaces between what was known and what was true. However, Leaport did not exist in a vacuum. Over just 60 miles to the northwest, Chicago was still recoiling from the revelations of H.H. Holmes, who had murdered dozens, if not more, within the walls of a custom-built hotel designed to kill. It was a horror the city would never forget, but rural towns like Leaport saw it differently. Crimes of that magnitude, they believed, were an urban sickness. There was comfort in thinking that monstrosities belonged to the chaos of the city and could not take root in fields and farmhouses. But evil does not respect geography, and quiet does not guarantee peace. The farmland surrounding Leaport was fertile, but it carried a history that made some locals uneasy. There were stories passed down between neighbors, strange accidents, unexpected deaths, and land that seemed to pass from one unlucky owner to the next. One family had buried 2 sons in the same year. Another lost their matriarch under suspicious circumstances. A young man was shot dead not far from the property Belle Gunness would one day buy. And a local madam was rumored to have been poisoned by her own sister and rival madam. No one used the word cursed, but some spoke it with their eyes. This was the Midwest at a time when information traveled slowly and law enforcement moved even slower. If someone committed a crime in one county and vanished into the next, it could be months before anyone pieced the details together, if they ever did. Police jurisdictions were small and communication between them unreliable. Rumors often did the work of reporters, and facts were built out of what people chose to believe. Those who disappeared without a trace were rarely pursued with urgency. It was a time when immigrant men, especially those from Scandinavia, moved freely across the region in search of opportunity. If one of them boarded a train and was never heard from again, it was more likely to be mourned as a lost chance than investigated as a crime. This made Leaport and towns like it a perfect place for a predator to hide in plain sight. Now, many women had little agency during this era, but widowhood offered a particular kind of power. A widow could own property, make legal decisions, and live without the scrutiny that younger unmarried women often endured. People extended sympathy and space to widows, assuming that their suffering had earned them privacy. And that is exactly what Belle Gunness received when she arrived in Leaport in 1901. She brought with her 3 children and a reputation for hard work. To the townspeople, she looked like someone who had endured hardship and was determined to start again. She bought land, kept to herself, and rarely asked for help. The town accepted her presence with little more than a nod. They saw a grieving mother who needed space, but they never imagined the horror she would bring with her. Now, Belle Gunness was not born in America, and she was not born as Belle. She was born Brynhild Paulsdottir Storsith on November...
What?
Brynhild Paulsdottir Storsith.
Say that 5 times fast.
Brynhild is her.
Brynhild is her real name. Paulsdottir comes from, that's how they would name, that's how you would get your last name, basically. Mm-hmm. That is technically her last name, Paulsdottir, because her father's name is Paul, and she is the daughter of Paul.
Oh, okay.
So, and then Storsith is the last name she carries, but that is the name of the farm that her family was tenants on. So that's how they came up with their names. You'd have the first name, then your father's name and whatever son, daughter, and then whatever farm you were working on or raising.
Okay.
So she was born Brynhild Paulsdottir Storsith on November 11, 1859, in the small village of Selbu, Norway, a place where survival was earned one season at a time. Tucked into the folds of Trøndelag County, Selbu was a landscape of pine forest, jagged peaks, and deep, biting winters. It was beautiful, yes, but it was not kind. The land demanded everything from those who lived on it. Brynhild came from working-class stock as tenants on a small farm. Though not a whole lot is known about her earliest years, there are some experiences that helped shape who she would become. Her father was a stonemason, her mother the keeper of a crowded household. She was the youngest of 8 children and quickly learned that nothing came without effort. From the time she could walk, she was helping haul water, mend fences, and labor beside the men in the family. There was no gentleness in her childhood, only the weight of necessity. And even then, she stood out. Brynhild was large for her age, tall, broad-shouldered, and strong. She did not look like the other girls in Selbu, and she didn't act like them either. She was quiet, sharp-eyed, and private. She didn't charm easily, and she didn't bend to expectations. According to some, she rarely, if at all, smiled unless there was a reason to. And while some found her strange, others found her intimidating. But by the age of 14, she had also fulfilled one of the most important milestones for a young Norwegian girl. She was confirmed in the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is the state church of Norway. This ceremony, a rite of passage into adulthood, was not taken lightly. Records show that Brynhild's conduct was noted as, quote, very good, suggesting that she was obedient, dutiful, and took her role in the church seriously. Those who knew her then, she was not rebellious, or to those who knew her then, she was not rebellious or wayward. She was solemn, hardworking, and grounded in the expectations of her faith and her community.
That's a word that'll never describe me. Obedient. It's not going to happen.
No.
Or well behaved. That won't describe me either.
That's so damn true.
I had them take that out of my vows. I said, I'm not going to lie to God. That love, honor, and obey. You can just say, I did. I told the preacher, just take that out. I ain't going to lie to everybody.
Well, whatever fire may have been simmering beneath the surface had not yet erupted, at least not publicly. But then came the story that still clings to her name even now. In her late teens, Brynhild was said to have become pregnant. The father, according to whispered rumors, was the son of a wealthy landowner, someone who believed himself above consequences. And one night, at a public dance, the young man attacked her. Whether out of anger or fear, he kicked her very hard in the abdomen. Brynhild fell to the floor and the child did not survive, forcing her to miscarry. The young man, protected by money and family reputation, faced no punishment. There was no arrest, no hearing, and no justice. And Brynhild's suffering was buried beneath the weight of silence. People in Selbu say Brynhild was never the same after that. With no verifiable records, however, the story, whether truth or folklore, lingered long after she was gone. The people of Selbu remembered how the brightness faded from her face. She worked longer hours, spoke fewer words, and they recalled how her eyes, already cold, seemed to freeze over entirely. If something changed in her, many point to this experience as to when that might have happened. Well, Brynhild grew into adulthood without tenderness as well. She watched the women around her grow old before their time, married young, worn down by childbirth, and their lives swallowed by toil. Perhaps she saw her own reflection and future in these women and decided she wanted something more. Or perhaps the damage had already been done. Either way, she began to look beyond Selbu. Collecting as much of her wages as she could from milking cows and herding cattle before sunrise, Brynhild laid the groundwork for something few girls in her village would ever attempt: a journey across the Atlantic. She aspired to follow in her older sister's footsteps. In 1881, at the age of 21, Brynhild left Norway for good. Now, she wasn't the only one, because during the last decades in the 19th century, waves of Norwegians were leaving their homeland in search of opportunity, land, and independence in America. Life in the fjords had grown increasingly difficult. Crops were failing and jobs had vanished, and young people saw no futures, so the solution was the sea. But Brynhild boarded a ship bound for New York, traveling alone on a weeks-long adventure across the Atlantic at 21 years old. When she arrived at Castle Garden, the predecessor to Ellis Island at the tip of Manhattan, Brynhild Paulsdottir Storstad made a quiet, decisive break from her past. She cast off the name that tied her to poverty, humiliation, and hard soil of Selbu, and she stepped into a new identity: Bella Peterson, or Bella Paulson, depending on which source you're reading. For our story, we're going to stick with Bella Peterson. The name was shorter, softer, and American, evoking poise, charm, and grace. It was everything she was not yet, but fully intended to become. Names could carry power, and Bella had no intention of letting hers go to waste. So she traveled to Chicago, where her older sister Nellie Larson had already settled. At the time, the city was alive with ambition, choked in smoke and industry, and overrun with immigrants from every corner of the globe. In this sprawling, impersonal landscape, Bella found what she needed the most: the ability to disappear. She took work as a domestic servant, cleaning homes for wealthy families who barely registered her presence. She ironed their linens, polished their silver, and prepared their meals with exacting care. But as she worked, she watched, and she listened. She learned how status moved through a room, how appearance shielded cruelty, and how the performance of civility often masked something more opportunistic underneath. Some accounts suggest she may have also worked in one of Chicago's many butcher shops or meatpacking plants. These industries at the same time were fueled by immigrant labor and known for grueling conditions. If Bella did work in such places, she would have learned how to handle cleavers, process animal carcasses, and operate with speed and precision. While there is no formal record confirming her employment in these environments, her later actions have led many to believe that she acquired certain skills somewhere, and the meatpacking district would have been a natural fit. So Chicago didn't just shape her, it hardened her. She learned the language and mastered the city's rhythm while studying human behavior with a kind of detached precision. To those around her, she seemed quiet, even distant, but behind that silence, Bella was taking notes. She was learning how the world worked and how she might bend it. In America, Bella was no longer a stonemason's daughter. She was a woman reinvented, and soon she would learn just how far reinvention could take her. Now, in 1884, 3 years after arriving in the United States, Bella Peterson married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant living in Chicago. He worked as a department store detective, quiet, mild-mannered, and without the burden of ambition. Their relationship was not built on love or passion, but on practicality. Mads offered stability, legality, and predictability, and Bella offered structure, control, and the appearance of domestic respectability. Theirs was a quiet agreement, and Bella, then and always, was the one in charge. They settled into a modest home in a Norwegian neighborhood in Chicago's northwest side, and it was here that Bella began to craft the image of a family. Now, sometime in the early 1890s is when Belle Sorensen, now Belle Sorensen, first brought Jenny Olsen into the home. She was not an infant, but a child old enough to help around the house, to observe, and to remember the movements of the adults around her. Now, the circumstances of her guardianship were never clearly explained, though it is thought that Jenny was willed to Belle by a close friend. And she would remain under Belle's roof for more than a decade, and in that time would become both a part of the family and, in her own way, a potential threat. Well, by 1894, Belle and Mads decided they wanted to try their hand at a business. They opened a small candy store, hoping to improve their financial footing. Belle ran the daily operations, often with Jenny by her side. And the store was modest, a little more than a shop front lined with penny candy jars and long hours. But it never succeeded. Business dwindled, debts crept in, and tragedy struck one night when the shop caught fire. Belle and Jenny were inside when the flames broke out, but both escaped unharmed. Belle ran into the street yelling fire as neighbors emerged to help, but the building was quickly lost. Belle claimed that a small kerosene lamp was to blame, but the insurance investigators found no evidence of a lamp, broken glass, or anything to support that explanation. So the fire was never explained, and no one asked too many more questions. What, Ryan?
It's very interesting that you made a comparison to her and H.H. Holmes earlier, because you said he was operating around the same time in Chicago. He was also committing fraud to get money to do what he was going to do. So that's pretty interesting that those two were kind of working along the same MO at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're going to set a fire, at least make it look good. Break something, kick some stuff over. You know, that just doesn't seem like it's very well thought out. And I find it interesting that the first marriage is to someone who is in law enforcement.
Yeah, a department store detective. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's in. I mean, I guess if he's a detective of some kind,
wouldn't he just kind of be loss prevention? Isn't that what he was like at?
Probably
at
that would probably
Maybe.
be the equivalent of what it is today, like a loss prevention of sorts. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now the candy.
He could put the head cuffs on you. I bet.
Back then, you probably could.
Probably
I don't
could.
think you
Probably.
can anymore, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the fire, I mean, it was a complete, like, it took the entire inside. Like, the building itself didn't burn down, but the entire inside was a complete loss. But anyways, I was like, no lamp, go figure. So
I should have known when she said, "Oh no, a fire! Someone help!"
Yeah. Well, the fire was never explained, and no one asked too many more questions. Chicago was a city of fire hazards, and insurance companies had seen it all. So the Sorensens collected the insurance payout, recovered their investment, and moved on. Still, a pattern was beginning to take shape. Between 1896 and 1898, 4 children were living in the Sorensen home, in addition to Jenny Olsen. There was Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. Now, given the number of children over 2 years, it is easy to see that Belle probably took some children in. Some adopted, others possibly fostered, and perhaps even some of her own. Now, the origins remain contested, even the alleged biological children, Myrtle and Lucy Sorensen, and Belle did present herself to the world as their mother. But unfortunately, 2 of the children in Belle's care, Caroline and Axel, died in infancy. Caroline passed away at just 5 months old, and Axel died at 3 months. The official cause in both cases was acute colitis, a diagnosis often used in the era for a broad range of digestive issues, including cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea. But these were also telltale symptoms of something else, strychnine poisoning. Now, prior to the deaths, Belle had taken out life insurance policies on each child, as she did with all her children. And when they died, she collected without delay. Now, an exact amount for the fire and both children's deaths has never been specified. However, through research, given the working class status of the Sorensens, on average for the time, these could be anywhere from $500 to $1,000 each in 1898.
That's a lot then.
For a total of $57,000 to $114,000 in today's money.
Wow.
Now, Belle's reaction to her children's death was restrained. There was no displays of grief, no collapse of spirit. Instead, she remained composed, even mechanical, keeping her home in order, continuing to raise Myrtle, Lucy, and Ginny, and maintaining her image as a mother doing the best she could. To her neighbors, Bella was resilient. To her sister, Nellie, she was something else entirely, creating an estrangement that would last for years. Years later, Nellie Larson would speak candidly about her sister. She described Bella during this time not simply as quiet, but as emotionally removed, someone who operated at a distance even with those closest to her. Nellie said Bella valued money more than people, that affection had no real place in her life, and that companionship was less important than control. It was an observation few around Belle had voiced aloud at the time. Again, to her neighbors, she appeared orderly and composed. Her home was tidy, her children well-dressed, and her posture never faltered, no matter how many tragedies passed through the door. And on July 30th, 1900, another one arrived. That morning, Mads Sorensen returned home from work complaining of a persistent headache. Bella later told friends she had given him a dose of quinine powder, a standard remedy kept in most households for fevers and pain. She said he went to lie down, and that when she checked on him later, he was no longer breathing. He had passed away. Now, 2 physicians were called to examine the body. One attributed his death to a cerebral hemorrhage. The other suspected heart failure, citing a pre-existing condition Mads had been treated for previously. And with no signs of trauma and 2 plausible natural causes, there was little reason to probe further. So no autopsy was performed, and Mads was buried without delay. But one detail refused to settle. Because you see, on July 30th, 1900, that was one single day, on which 2 of Mads' life insurance policies briefly overlapped. One worth $2,000 was expiring that afternoon. The other worth $3,000 would take effect that morning. Because his coincidental death occurred within that narrow window, where one policy was still active as another began, Belle collected on both policies, receiving a combined payout of $5,000.
And nobody thought that was suspicious at the time. Okay.
Well, in 1900, it was a life-changing amount, enough to purchase several homes or a sizable piece of land with money to spare. It would be the equivalent of $190,000 in 2025.
Jesus.
Now, to give an average of Belle's net worth, with everything that we've talked about so far, she would be sitting at, on the low end, roughly $250,000 in today's money.
And this is within the course of 2 years.
This is in the course from, 1898 to 1900. Yeah.
Huh.
However,
Mads getting a little suspicious.
Mads' family was troubled. His brothers, in particular, questioned the circumstances and found Belle's demeanor very concerning. She hadn't wept and she hadn't stumbled. She had simply managed the arrangements and moved forward just as she always did. They voiced their concerns to the authorities, but without an autopsy or concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was nothing to investigate. The paperwork was in order and the policies were valid. The death officially was ruled as natural. So the case was closed. And not long after, Belle quickly began tying up loose ends. She sold off their Chicago home, liquidated what belongings she didn't need, and quietly prepared for the next chapter. With Ginny, Myrtle, and Lucy in tow, she left the city that had given her anonymity, experience, and ultimately a foundation. Now, in 1901, Belle Sorensen arrived in Leaport, Indiana, with her 3 children, Myrtle, Lucy, and foster daughter Jenny Olson, and the proceeds of her late husband's life insurance payout. With over $5,000 in hand, she paid cash for a 42-acre farm on McClung Road just outside of town. She introduced herself as a recently widowed mother seeking peace and security for her girls. It was a simple story, spoken plainly, and in Leaport, that was all it took. The town met her with quiet acceptance. There was no background checks, no probing questions. Belle's status as a grieving mother and hardworking woman offered built-in credibility. She didn't challenge the town's rhythm, she matched it. She worked her land with visible determination, hauling feed, managing livestock, and overseeing daily tasks without help. Neighbors occasionally spotted her in the fields or in town, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the purpose of someone who had no time for idleness. She was a widow, raising children, running a farm, and asking nothing from anyone. That was respectable, and that was enough. Her reputation formed quickly. She was tough, independent, and private. She didn't gossip, didn't socialize, and didn't pretend to be anything other than what she appeared. When she came into town for supplies, she spoke directly, paid in full, and left as quickly as she'd arrived. Her demeanor lacked warmth, but not competence. She had the bearing of someone who had endured loss and built herself around it. And while Belle's public image was one of quiet strength, the world inside her farmhouse operated by a different set of rules. There, Belle maintained a household shaped not by warmth, but by exacting control. She was not cruel, but she was unbending. She expected obedience, valued silence, and kept emotion at an arm's length. What mattered to Belle wasn't comfort, it was order. And her children moved within that framework. Myrtle and Lucy, still young, followed routines that left little room for play. They were clean, quiet, and well-mannered. There were no reported beatings or obvious mistreatment, nothing visible or scandalous, but there was no affection. Belle's style of motherhood was managerial. Tasks were assigned and expectations were met. And when they weren't, consequences were handled privately. You got something, Shelley?
No,
oh, okay, sorry.
I'm just thinking. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to show this picture of Jenny again because this is about the time that she's around this old in this picture. Jenny Olson, older now and more perceptive, occupied a more complex space in the household. Once a child, she had now grown into a young girl who watched and understood more than she was meant to. Jenny helped with housework, assisted Belle in town, and likely took on a surrogate parenting role with the younger girls. But her presence, once entirely useful, now carried a different weight. Just as Jenny matured, she also became a witness. Someone who saw Belle's patterns and perhaps began to question them. Whether Belle feared Jenny or simply began calculating her limitations isn't known, but their relationship would become significant in time. Still, from the outside, nothing seemed amiss. No bruises, no broken windows, and no cries in the night. Just a strict mother, well-respected in town, managing a household on her own. In an era where hardship was expected and privacy was paramount, Belle's severity passed easily as discipline. And behind her closed doors, no one asked what it might have cost to keep things so perfectly still. Now, in the spring of 1902, a familiar name returned to Belle's life. Peter Gunness, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who had once briefly boarded with Belle and Mad Sorensen during their marriage in Chicago. He had since moved back to Minnesota and started a family of his own. After the death of his first wife, who died in childbirth, Peter was left a widower with two young daughters, Jenny and Swanhild Gunness. Belle reconnected with Peter while visiting family in Minnesota. What prompted her visit, family obligation, business, or something more calculated, was never fully clear. But once they crossed paths again, the bond was quickly renewed. They were both widowed, both of Norwegian descent, and both navigating a country that often felt foreign. Belle, now a landowning mother with a respectable farm, offered Peter something that may have felt like stability. Peter, with his quiet disposition and shared cultural values, offered Belle something she had rarely tolerated, but occasionally entertained: companionship. So they married swiftly in April of 1902, scarcely a year after Belle had arrived in Leaport, and just under 2 years since Mad Sorensen's death. Peter returned with Belle to Leaport, bringing Swanhild and Jenny, who joined Belle's existing household: Jenny Olson, Myrtle, and Lucy. So for the first time, there were 5 children under Belle's roof. The house was full, the land was work, and from the outside, the Gunness farm seemed to be entering a new chapter of life. But the illusion was shattered almost immediately. What were you going to say, Ryan?
So she's visiting family in Minnesota, and she meets this guy in Minnesota, and they marry before she comes back. Like, she's just hanging out, and they're like, "Oh, let's get married and come move to my farm."
No, they married, and he ended up coming back. He ended up coming up to Leaport.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, to be with her. So, and he brought his 2 daughters with him. Now there's 2 Jennies in the house, so don't get confused. There's Jenny Gunness and there's Jenny Olson.
Okay.
So.
And maybe it was so swift because, being a single parent in any capacity, even today, is difficult. But to be a male single parent, especially with 2 daughters, I'm sure he was looking for a mother for his children. And she happened to be there, be willing. Why not? She had 3 kids. Her farm was well run. She's self-sufficient. And
Now, I
this
will
is
say,
what my girls need.
I will say at this time, or during this time, we're talking early 1900. Belle is probably, at this point, I believe she is over 30. She's born in 59. So whatever that math is, 40, 43, 40, 43. She is not described very pleasantly in anything that I ever read. She, by all accounts, with a lot of people, they state she's kind of haggard looking. And she is broad-shouldered, 5'7" to 5'9", and around 250 pounds. By the standards of that time, she is not the standard of beauty. I'm going to put it that way.
Right.
So probably also what Peter saw was this 42-acre farm. Oh, hell, there's a 42-acre farm that I can attach my name to.
Right.
Because that is a big thing back then. To be a master of a farm that size, or to be an owner, operator, or anything like that, they called it master back then of a farm.
Right.
Of that size. Like, go ahead.
Well, and you had a female who was already working it. And, yes, she probably isn't described very nicely. But you have to remember, I don't know how many people you know, quite a few. They usually don't, if they're females, they don't usually put on makeup or fix their hair because, as I've been told, the cows don't care. So,
that's true.
Yeah,
I mean, very true. Yeah,
it's one of those things that farm life is hard, up and out in the sun all day and working your farm, your ranch, whatever it is, working with the animals, the garden. You're outside. There wasn't probably a lot of sunscreen then either. So,
nope, there wasn't. And the thing, everything that I read reflected that. I mean, her skin was very tough, wrinkled. Her hands were very mannish, very rough, calloused hands. She's not a soft woman by any means.
No.
So
no
I'm
one
sure
would mistake her for being delicate.
Yeah, exactly.
Large and sunbaked.
Yeah. So, well, just 5 days after their wedding, Jenny Gunness, Peter's infant daughter, died unexpectedly. The official cause was listed as edema of the lungs, fluid accumulation that interfered with breathing, but no inquest followed. Her body was quietly shipped back to Chicago, where Belle had her buried alongside the other dead children already resting there. No investigation was opened, and no one asked why tragedy always seemed to follow Belle Gunness, as she now was known. They simply looked away. With Jenny Gunness gone, Swanhild remained the only surviving child from Peter's side. Belle continued running the farm, and Peter returned to work, but cracks had already begun to form. In the months that followed, Peter began confiding in his brother Gus back in Minnesota. He expressed growing unease about Belle and their household. The specifics of his concerns were never recorded, but his instincts were strong enough that he began making arrangements for Swanhild's safety. He did not send her away during his life, but there were indications that he intended to. But by the end of that year, he would no longer be in a position to protect her. It was on the night of December 16th, 1902, 8 months after their nuptials. The Gunness farmhouse settled into winter silence. Inside, the family had spent the evening as they often did, each in their role, each in their place. Belle, according to her later testimony, had been in the kitchen stuffing sausage casings from pork that Peter had ground earlier that day. It was domestic work, unremarkable and rhythmic. She claimed that as part of her routine, she placed the meat grinder on a high shelf to dry, something she insisted she always did. Peter, she said, was in the kitchen too, bending over near the fire, warming his shoes. Then there was a crash. Belle would later describe the scene in vivid detail. The meat grinder had fallen from the shelf and struck Peter in the head. At the same time, a bowl of hot brine had spilled, scalding him. The mixture of metal, heat, and surprise left him stunned, but not unconscious. Belle said she rushed to his side, treated his wounds herself, applying baking soda, liniment water, and Vaseline to soothe the burns. Peter, she insisted, waved off the idea of a doctor. "It's nothing," she said he told her. She helped him to the parlor, made a place for him to sleep, and left him there to rest. But later that night, Belle said she awoke to the sound of Peter stumbling through the house, calling out for her, or yelling, "Mama," is what he cried. He was disoriented, maybe in pain, and maybe confused. So Belle said she sent Jenny Olson, just 13 years old, to fetch the neighbors. She gave her a stove poker for protection in the dark, and Jenny ran out into the night toward the Nicholson farm. By the time Jenny could reach the Nicholsons and Swan Nicholson return, Peter Gunness was dead. He was found face down in the parlor, motionless, blood pooled beneath his head. No one had seen it happen, and no one had heard a second crash. The house was quiet again, but not in the same way. However, this time, there would be questions that needed to be answered. But there was no formal investigations, not a sheriff with a badge and suspicion. Instead, there was a simple inquest, a procedural hearing held not in a courtroom, but in the very room where Peter died. And it was a performance Belle knew how to give. She took the stand and told her story with exacting detail. From the sausage making to the grinder, the spill, the homemade remedies, and Peter's refusal to see a doctor. She was calm, articulate, and eerily unshaken. Every detail came easily and every question had an answer. Then came Jenny Olson. Though she had been asleep when the alleged accident occurred, Jenny echoed Belle's story almost word for word. She recalled the butchering, the stove, the meat grinder. She spoke of how Peter looked, how Belle reacted, and what happened next. She even repeated things she couldn't have possibly known, things that Belle had apparently told her to say. Her testimony was way too perfect, too rehearsed. And then Dr. Charles Bowl, the coroner, came along with Peter's autopsy. What he described did not match the story Belle and Jenny had so carefully laid out. Peter's body showed no evidence of burns, not on his skin, not on his clothes. The scalding brine had left no trace. What he did find was something else entirely. A broken nose, a sharp laceration to the back of the skull, a fractured cranium, and massive internal bleeding. The wound was clean and focused, the kind of blow that suggested a single forceful strike, not the accidental fall of kitchenware and not the chaos of a spill. It looked like an execution. And so Belle's neighbors began to talk. They'd been willing to believe the children had died of illnesses. They even overlooked the fire at the candy store, but this was harder to ignore. And then it became impossible to ignore. Because not long after Peter's death, Belle's daughter Myrtle allegedly whispered something to a classmate. Quote, "My mama killed my papa. She hit him with a meat cleaver. Don't tell a soul." It was the kind of statement that in another household would have sparked alarm, but in Belle's, it was smothered. The classmate said nothing until it was too late. And by the time the town had questions, there were no charges filed. Despite Dr. Bowles' findings and Jenny's eerie recital, Peter's death was ultimately ruled as accidental. There were no witnesses, no weapon recovered, and no one willing to accuse a very composed widow in a dark farmhouse. So Peter was buried in Chicago alongside his infant daughter. And Belle mourned in silence, if she mourned at all, and returned to her routines. There was no black veil and no faltering step. She had children to look after, particularly little Swanhild, who was the sole beneficiary of Peter's life insurance. Swanhild, the daughter Peter had brought into Belle's home, remained with her for several months. But fate, luckily, would step in. In early 1903, Peter's brother, Gus Gunness, came down from Minnesota in a fury. He wanted answers as things were not adding up. He asked about Peter's investments, about Swanhild's well-being, and he was met with Belle's vagueness, dismissiveness, and strangely detached, stating that Peter had put the investment into a mining company. So he asked where the paperwork was. She offered no clear accounting paperwork about the life insurance nor its payout, and no convincing explanation. She simply looked at him, smiled, and said, "Why don't you stay a while and manage the farm?" Is what she offered Gus.
Oh, hell no.
Gus said a chill went through him, and by the time that the sun rose, Gus and Swanhild were nowhere to be found. Under cover of darkness, Gunness left Leaport with Swanhild in his arms, quietly returning to Minnesota with the last remaining piece of his brother's legacy. Behind him, the Gunness farmhouse loomed in silence. Inside, Belle tended to business as she always had, efficiently, without sentiment. She had just secured another $2,500 life insurance payout without delay, and her face betrayed no sorrow, no apology, and no change. But the world around her was shifting. The town that had once extended her the benefit of the doubt no longer met her eyes. People who had once called her strong now called her distant. The neighbors who had admired her for surviving so much had begun to question why she survived so often. Whispers followed her into town, and children stopped lingering near her property. The sense of respect Belle had once quietly commanded was beginning to curdle into something colder. Now, the transformation wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, shaped by patterns no longer easy to ignore. First Mads, then the children, then Peter, and now the farm stood full of life on paper, but hollow in presence. Now, a few months after Peter Gunness's death, another child appeared in Belle's home, an infant boy named Philip. Now, his arrival was cloaked in mystery. By the way, that is a more later photo of Belle. And the two daughters that are pictured are Myrtle and Lucy. Lucy being the younger one.
God
Philip's
almighty.
in front.
She looks like the Trunchbull from Matilda.
And it's thought that Lucy and Matilda, right?
Lucy and Myrtle.
Lucy and Myrtle. It's thought that those might be her legitimate children.
The three children that are listed here, or that are shown here in this photo, Lucy being on the far left, the shorter girl, Myrtle being in the middle, the taller girl, and Philip sitting in the lap. These are the three children that are alleged to be Belle's actual children.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the only three that are alleged to be Belle's actual biological children. So
the three that are still alive.
Correct.
A quick question too, while we're talking about her children.
Yeah.
Because was it Myrtle who whispered in the classroom, "Hey, my mom killed my dad
Correct.
with a meat cleaver"?
Allegedly, correct. Yes.
Yeah. So I would be fearing for Myrtle's life at this point, because now she's on Belle's radar even more so because she's telling her secrets. So I'm a little worried to see what happens to poor little Myrtle.
Well, we will find out here in a little bit.
Okay.
Well, Philip's arrival was cloaked in mystery. I'm going to put his picture back up. Philip's arrival was cloaked in mystery. Although Belle claimed to have given birth, neighbors were skeptical. A midwife had been summoned, but found that the baby had already been born, bathed, and clothed. Even more baffling, Belle was seen just days later performing farm chores, hauling laundry, chasing pigs, without the fatigue expected of a woman who had just delivered a child. The townspeople whispered that the baby had not come from Belle's womb at all, but had been adopted under murky circumstances. Now, her interactions with the community grew strained throughout 1903. Where once she had nodded politely at the postmaster or chatted briefly with the grocer, now she brought accusations. She confronted neighbors about missing livestock, accused them of trespassing, and issued threats and letters that dripped with indignation. Belle no longer tried to belong. She pushed people away before they could pull back first. And in that widening distance, she made a decision. She would no longer look for support from the town that had turned cold to her. She would no longer wait for trust or tolerance from neighbors who barely concealed their suspicion. If Leaport would not provide what she needed, then she would turn to others, those beyond the reach of rumor, beyond the familiarity of loss. They would not know her story, and they would not hear whispers, and when they came, they would bring with them something far more useful than comfort: hope, promise of something new, and cash. But by the end of 1903, a year after Peter's death, Belle Gunness had lost the goodwill of Leaport, but she had not lost her ambition. If anything, her isolation had clarified her path. She no longer needed to cultivate trust locally. What she needed was money. Money to sustain the farm, to maintain appearances, and to ensure that no one else had power over her. But she wasn't about to beg for it. She would do what she always did: create an opportunity that looked like an invitation. That opportunity took the form of matrimonial advertisements. She began placing them in Norwegian language newspapers like the Scandinavian and in Midwest farm journals read by immigrants and settlers seeking companionship. The wording was always the same tone: cordial, modest, and promising. She described herself as a comely widow with a thriving farm, capable children, and a yearning for a man of means who might help her manage the land and share her life. She offered a second chance to those who had grown tired of loneliness, and a fertile patch of land for men who believed in building something from the soil. But there was something else woven between the lines, something that wasn't said but was very strongly suggested. Prospects were encouraged to bring money. Those who responded to her letters were often instructed to liquidate assets, to bring cash rather than checks, and to come quietly. In return, they were offered a woman of resilience, a ready-made home, and a life with purpose. It was a brilliant lie, and Belle told it well. The letters poured in. The postman delivering mail to the Gunness farm recalled seeing as many as 10 letters a day addressed to Belle.
Damn.
She read them in private, responded in her careful handwriting, and tracked each reply like a merchant with a growing inventory.
It's a lonely heart scam. And just like any other modern dating app, people lie. They just lie.
It was the Tinder of the day. Just kidding.
It was.
Swipe right, swipe left.
Dude, she's like H.H. Holmes meets Nanny Doss. She is. Ugh.
That's a good little mashup right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
For Belle, these men weren't suitors. They were assets in motion, marked not by compatibility, but liquidity. They came from across the Midwest, Wisconsin, Kansas, South Dakota, Illinois, men who had to believe in something because they had no one left to rely on. Some were widowers, some were bachelors too long alone. Others had already begun to withdraw from the world when Belle's offer landed in their hands. She gave them something that felt like a lifeline. And all she asked in return was that they bring everything with them. And once again, Belle had identified a need and positioned herself as the solution. Only this time what she offered wasn't a future. When Belle Gunness opened her mailbox each morning, she wasn't looking for companionship. She was counting opportunities. But what none of them realized was that they weren't responding to an invitation, or they were responding to an invitation not for a future, but for a funeral. The first to arrive was Olaf Lindboe, a 33-year-old Norwegian immigrant who had only recently settled in Chicago after coming to America 3 years prior. In February 1904, he responded to a help wanted ad in the Scandinavian and packed up his things, including $600 in life savings, and traveled to Leaport. He was hired promptly by Belle as a farmhand, but their relationship soon took on the appearance of something far more intimate. Neighbors noted how close they'd become, referring to Olaf as Belle's fiancé. He seemed comfortable in the role, even writing to his father back in Norway to announce that he would soon be married. But that letter would be the last anyone heard from him. When questioned about Olaf's sudden disappearance, Belle offered different stories to different people. She told one neighbor that Olaf had gone to St. Louis to see the World's Fair and buy land. To another, she claimed he had returned to Norway to see the king's coronation. To Olaf's own father, she wrote and insisted he had gone west to Homestead. The only truth was that he was gone, but his trunk, with his clothes, remained at the farm. Then came Henry Gerholdt in the spring of 1905. He too arrived with a heavy trunk, eager to begin work. Within a few months, Belle claimed he had abruptly returned to Chicago, leaving behind his belongings, including a thick fur coat. When the same neighbor who had seen Henry arrive later saw Belle wearing that coat, the explanation felt suddenly thin. Why would a man leave town in winter to head to Chicago without it? Well, the pattern had begun. George Bradley, 40 years old, of Tuscola, Illinois, left his home with $1,500 in cash in the belief he was headed for work and possibly marriage on a Leaport farm. He was never seen again. Then Christian Hilkvin, who sold his farm in Dover, Wisconsin for $2,000, forwarding his mail to the Gunness address as he departed. Emil Tell, a bachelor from Osage, Kansas, quit his job and told his boss he was going to marry a wealthy widow. He carried $2,000 in his pocket. Ole Budsberg, 50 and widowed, sold his farm in Iola, Wisconsin. He told his sons he was headed to Indiana to get married. He left with $1,000. In December 1905, John Moe, a 40-year-old bachelor from Elbow Lake, Minnesota, visited his local bank and cashed out $1,000 in checks. He told the bank teller he was headed to Leaport. And the list of suspected men continued. T.J. McJenkins from Coropolis, Pennsylvania, Andrew Anderson from Lawrence, Kansas, John Sorensen from St. Joseph, Missouri, Andrew Schwindler from Cincinnati, Ohio, Charles Edmonds from Newcastle, Indiana, Linder Nicholson from Huron, South Dakota, Ole Olson from Battle Creek, Michigan, Axel Gunderson from Green Lake, Wisconsin.
Jesus Christ.
Belle's web was far and wide. Each of these men came willingly, some even joyfully, and each vanished without trace. Belle offered stories when asked. Some went west, some went home, some simply changed their minds. But the trunks always stayed, and their clothes remained. In one room of the Gunness house, neighbors would later find a collection of about 15 unclaimed trunks, each full of men's clothing, pressed but ownerless. Emil Greening, a 19-year-old farmhand hired by Belle, recalled it clearly. Quote, Miss Gunness received male visitors all the time. A different man came nearly every week to stay at the house. Belle explained away each one as a cousin from Kansas, South Dakota, Wisconsin, or Chicago. But Greening and others began to notice that the visitors arrived, but no one ever actually saw them leave, despite Belle's stories. Belle's operation was flawless. She didn't need to leave the farm. She didn't need to pursue her marks. She just needed to wait patiently, like a black widow in her web, waiting for the next line to be pulled. Although it is still unknown the exact number of men that appeared during this time, between February 1409 and the summer of 1906, it is estimated that at least 15 men arrived at the Gunness farm, and 15 men disappeared. Given the life savings from the known victims of Belle, each man is estimated to have brought with them $500 to $2,000 each, which means in the course of 2 years, on an average, Belle Gunness could have added as much as $20,000 to her net worth, or $720,000 in today's times. Given the payouts from her earliest adventures, this would have made Belle Gunness a millionaire by now in today's times. Go ahead, Chelsea.
So she was going to work on average of over 2 years, 15 men, and they were saying there was a man coming in about every week or every other week.
Yep.
She's killing somebody every 2 to 3 weeks.
Seems like
allegedly.
It.
Allegedly, because they have to get
disappearing.
Basically,
every 2 to 3 weeks.
Her kind of MO would be like, man would arrive, he'd work for a little bit, maybe a month or two, then he'd disappear. So maybe not every 2 weeks or something like that, but there were multiple of them showing up within weeks and stuff like that. Now, whether each one of those stayed on the farm, I don't know.
Something I do find very interesting with this is we know she seems to be money motivated for whatever she's doing for her MO, but she's starting to keep trophies. She's keeping all of their trunks, keeping their clothes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's, I don't know, that's weird because she seems like she's just killing for money, but so why keep the trophies? Why keep the trunks? Why not throw them out?
Yeah. I mean, you would think that would be like a dead giveaway if somebody came to the house. It was like, what the hell's up with 15 trunks in your room?
Absolutely.
But if she was trying to garner sympathy, she could say, they keep coming in and they just leave. Yeah. They leave. They leave me here to clean up their mess like every other man has done. It could be a play for sympathy. I have to keep it. What if he comes back? He'll be angry with me if he comes back and it's not here.
Yeah. Well, by the summer of 1906, Belle Gunness had perfected her machinery of death. She no longer needed to improvise. She had a system, efficient, ruthless, and quiet. But every system, no matter how polished, eventually meets its limit. And for Belle, that limit began with a single letter. It came from Andrew Helgelian, a 49-year-old Norwegian bachelor living in Aberdeen, South Dakota. He was quiet, practical, and lonely. The death of his wife had left him unmoored, and Belle's ad in the Scandinavian paper offered exactly what he thought he needed: companionship, purpose, and a second chance. The first exchange was brief, but Belle responded quickly, and soon they were writing often. The tone shifted from modest to affectionate with remarkable speed. She called him her, quote, very best and faithfulest friend, praised his honesty, and spoke of him not as a stranger, but as a man whose place beside her had already been decided. She didn't ask him to visit right away. She laid the groundwork slowly. In her letters, Belle wove a life for them, one where Andrew would take over management of her farm, where they would raise her children together, and where happiness would be simple, honest, and secure. But as the letters continued, the promises became conditions. She asked him not to tell anyone where he was going. She urged him to bring cash, not checks. And most of all, she asked him to liquidate his holdings, sell his livestock, his equipment, even his land. Belle painted it all as romantic practicality. Why wait? Why waste time? Come now, come ready, and they would begin immediately. What Andrew couldn't see was how deliberately he was being pulled into her orbit. He thought he was heading toward a future. In truth, he was walking into a trap 18 months in the making. And while Belle was drawing Andrew Helgelian into her web through ink and promise, life on the farm continued with the same surface routines: chores, school, structure. But underneath that veneer, something else was also shifting. Jenny Olsen, Belle's foster daughter, was no longer a child. She had grown into a sharp and observant teenager, full of questions and aware in a way that made Belle very uncomfortable. Jenny had lived under Belle's roof for over a decade. She knew the rhythms of the household, the secrets it kept, and the tension that lingered in the air when new men came to call. Jenny watched everything, and worse, she remembered. As she matured, Jenny began to attract attention from boys in town. Emil Greening, the 19-year-old hired to help on the farm, took a particular liking to her. Their connection was innocent but genuine. Walks, shared chores, perhaps even whispered plans for something beyond the suffocating walls of Belle's farmhouse. But then, without warning, Belle announced that Jenny was going away. She was to attend a finishing school in California, Belle said. The story was simple, almost bland. An opportunity had arisen, and Belle, being the doting mother figure, was sending Jenny off to better her prospects. She told Emil about a professor who would be arriving to escort Jenny. And then the day that the professor was due, Belle sent her farmhand Emil into town on an errand. When he returned, he was devastated. Jenny was gone. Belle told him she already left. The professor had unfortunately come early. There was no time for goodbyes as Jenny was on her way west. Well, the story held for a while, but no one in town saw Jenny leave. There was no buggy, no luggage, no witness to her departure. Later that same day, another boy, John Widener, arrived at the house. Jenny had asked him to please stop by so she could say goodbye. Belle told him the same thing she had told Emil. Jenny had already gone. But John didn't believe Belle either, as rumors ran rampant in town. Over the next 2 years, John wrote letters to the California school Belle had mentioned. He never received a reply. Jenny Olsen had vanished. There was no announcement, no forwarding address, and no follow-up. Belle simply never mentioned her again.
Wow.
And the boys who cared for Jenny, Emil and John, were left with the silence Belle always used to cover her trail. However, Jenny's disappearance marked something new. This wasn't a man lured by greed. This was someone who knew too much, who had seen too much, and who may have asked one too many questions. Whatever Jenny knew, she would never get the chance to share it. Regardless, with Jenny's absence, Belle Gunness needed help around the farm more than ever. In the summer of 1906, Belle hired a Polish man, William Brogiski. Truly, she only needed one thing from him: dig holes in the muck of her fenced-off hog pen. Precision was expected, though. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep. William did as he was told, and by the time he'd returned back to the farm, he found the holes had already been filled back up.
What the?
He didn't ask any questions. Why would he? It was common practice on a farm to bury things the landowner found disposable. By the summer of 1906, the Gunness farm had taken on an eerie quiet. Jenny Olsen was gone, and the stream of male visitors had grown more discreet, more careful. Belle had learned how to better hide the machinery of her operation, but she still needed more hands. Someone to tend the hogs, haul the feed, split wood, and ask no questions. That's when she hired Ray Lamphere. He came to her like many of her employees had, ruthless, worn down, and eager to prove his usefulness. Ray was in his mid-30s, a man with little to his name and not much direction. He had drifted from job to job, city to town, leaving behind only a trail of rumors about drinking and unpredictable temper. But Ray was also deeply lonely. And Belle, for all her rigid routines and watchful silences, knew how to read people. What she saw in Ray was exactly what she needed: someone malleable. He was given quarters on the property and immediately put to work. He fixed the fencing along the east pasture, repaired the barn doors, tended to the hogs in the back lot. He was rough around the edges, but dependable in the way a man becomes when he knows he could lose everything with a single misstep. And he wanted to impress her, not just as an employer, but as a woman. It wasn't long before people in Leaport noticed their walks together through town. Belle would move through the dry goods store with her usual poise, measured, unreadable, and Ray would trail behind her, alert and attentive, always carrying something and watching. He was possessive in his quiet way, glaring at other men who looked too long, stepping close when she paused to speak to anyone else. Around others, Belle never confirmed what they were. She didn't have to. Ray believed he was hers. Whether Belle ever returned his feelings was irrelevant. What mattered was that Ray was willing to serve, and for a time, she allowed him the illusion of intimacy. She didn't scold his jealousy. She didn't correct his assumptions. She gave him just enough to stay loyal, but never enough to feel secure. For Belle, that was always the balance. Control, disguised as affection. And Ray, unstable as he was, became infatuated. He was seen around the farm more often than not. When Belle disappeared for long stretches into town, to the bank, to the train station, Ray would stay behind, tending the property, watching the road, and sometimes drinking to drown whatever questions he couldn't ask. But what Ray didn't understand, what he was never meant to understand, was that Belle's affections were like everything else in her life, calculated, temporary, and always expendable. She kept him close, but never closer than her secrets. When Andrew Helgelian stepped off the train in Leaport, the wind coming off the platform was sharp with winter and silence. He arrived dressed in a heavy fur coat, a suitcase in one hand, and almost $3,000 in certificates tucked in his coat lining. It would be her biggest score. His shoes were clean and his mind was steady. Everything he carried, his trust, his future, his worth, had been placed squarely in the hands of a woman he had never met. But he felt he knew her. For over a year and a half, Belle Gunness had written to him with affection so carefully shaped that it passed for intimacy. She spoke of partnership, shared work, and faith, of her children needing a father figure, and of her loneliness. It was a performance she had perfected. Long letters that felt confessional, full of warmth, strength, and quiet promise. Andrew, like the others, believed he had been chosen. When he reached the Gunness farm, Belle met him at the door, just as she said she would. There was no uncertainty in her tone, no awkwardness in the greeting. She welcomed him in as if he were returning home, and as if this was simply the next step in something long understood. The children were polite, the house was warm. Belle had made everything look as she had described. Except one detail. Ray lamed fear. See, Ray was still on the property, still working, still watching. He saw Andrew arrive. He saw the way Belle leaned in close, how she smiled without hesitation. He knew what it meant. He had been Belle's companion, her shadow, her protector, at least in his mind. Now he was nothing more than an obstacle. That night, as the house quieted and the lamps burned low, Belle told Ray plainly, "Go sleep in the barn." There was no softness in it, no room for discussion. Ray, who had once imagined himself in control, stood there without protest, his pride peeled away. He left, but he didn't go far. He did spend the night alone, surrounded by the rustle of straw and the howl of wind through the cracks in the barnwood. He couldn't see what was happening inside the house, but he didn't need to. He knew what came next. Another man brought to the farm, another man with money, another man slipping into the illusion Belle had spent years mastering. What Ray didn't realize and what he couldn't accept was that the game had already begun long before Andrew arrived. And now it was almost over. In the days that followed Andrew Helgelian's arrival, Belle kept her new guests close. She made sure he was seen in town, but only briefly. A quiet introduction at the First National Bank of Leaport marked the beginning of what would be Andrew's final recorded movements. He accompanied Belle to the teller window, where they presented a pair of certificates of deposits totaling $2,839. His entire fortune, meticulously collected and now placed directly in her hands. The transaction was uneventful, though not without friction. When the teller politely suggested converting the funds into a cashier's check, Belle's demeanor shifted. She stiffened, narrowed her eyes, and snapped, "Mind your own business." The words cut through the stillness of the room and ended the conversation. The money was counted, handed over in full, and folded into Belle's coat pocket without ceremony. That was January 6, 1908. Andrew was still alive. Over the next few days, he was seen only in passing, on the porch, walking the yard, helping Belle feed the hogs. He spoke little. To the neighbors who caught a glimpse of him, he seemed polite but distant. A man perhaps uncertain about the life he was entering. No one saw him smile, and no one ever saw him leave. And then came January 11th, 1908. That evening, Belle handed Ray Lamphere a note and told him, "Leave the farm." He was to travel to Michigan City to meet a cousin of hers who, conveniently, had never been mentioned before. Ray was given instructions to wait there overnight if needed and only return the next day with the cousin in tow. There were no details about who this cousin was, no explanation for why Belle hadn't gone herself. But Ray, perhaps eager to prove himself still useful, agreed. He boarded the train, made the 12-mile journey, and waited. But the cousin never showed. Don't believe they were real to begin with.
Yeah.
But
and
somewhere
he was told, "Don't come back without the cousin."
Right.
He was.
starting to get messy.
I kind of condensed that portion. He was basically told, "Go to this. Wait for my cousin. I got a horse trade. If the cousin doesn't show, they're probably delayed. Stay the night and check back in the morning. Only then in the morning, when they still haven't showed, can you come back. But don't come back without them in tow."
Yeah, sounds like it's an absolute
fabrication.
It's a ruse to get him out of the house.
Yeah. Well, somewhere between Michigan City and Leaport, Ray came to a conclusion that may have already been forming for weeks. He wasn't just being replaced. He was being removed. Despite his employer and her companion's instruction to stay overnight if needed, Ray decided to see what his lady was up to, and he boarded the train back to the Gunness farm. He arrived back in Leaport at 9:15 that evening and quietly slipped back onto the farm. Back at the farmhouse, however, Andrew Helgelian was gone. No one had ever seen him again. Not the bank clerk, not the neighbors, not the children. His name just simply stopped being mentioned. His coat no longer on the hook. The room he slept in was never opened again. In the official version of events, Belle's version, Andrew had left of his own accord. He had taken a train to Chicago or to New York, or as she would later claim, to Norway. The destination shifted with each telling. The only thing that never changed was that he left on his own. But those who had seen him last knew better. Andrew Helgelian hadn't walked away. He had disappeared the way Belle needed him to. Quietly, completely, most importantly, without any witnesses. After that night in early January, something in Ray Lamphere began to fracture. Whatever belief he had held that Belle might still choose him, whatever scraps of affection he had clung to, they were gone. The man who had taken his place had vanished just like the others. Ray didn't need to be told what had happened. He had lived too long on that farm, heard too many things in the quiet, and had seen too many men arrive with promise only to leave behind their trunks. Belle, as always, pretended nothing had changed. She went about her days with the same methodical resolve, feeding the livestock, keeping the children close, and traveling into town when necessary. But now Ray was on the outside. He no longer slept under her roof. He was no longer her helper, her confidant, her shadow. He was just another man she had dismissed. Except, unlike the others, Ray was still breathing, and he refused to disappear. He began returning to the farm at odd hours. Sometimes he came in the daylight, pounding on the door, demanding the return of his belongings. Other times he came under cover of night, lurking around the property, watching from the trees. Neighbors reported seeing him staggering along the road, muttering to himself. He drank more, fought more, grew more unstable in every passing week. He was unraveling in plain sight. Belle responded with precision. She filed trespassing charges, dragging Ray into courtrooms where she stood composed and articulate while he seethed beside her. She petitioned to have him declared insane, citing his erratic behavior, his threats, and his refusal to stay away. However, a medical commission examined him thoroughly, and though he showed signs of emotional distress, they ruled him sane. Well, Belle didn't like that answer. Within a week, she had Ray arrested again, this time over a dispute about tools and clothing he claimed she had withheld. He won the case with the help of an attorney and carefully documented alibi. But even in victory, Ray's position grew more precarious. He was now known fully in Leaport as a volatile man obsessed with the widow Gunness, a man whose presence seemed to foreshadow danger. And still, he kept talking. He told acquaintances that Belle had secrets. He hinted that things weren't what they seemed at the farm. He didn't name names, but he suggested there were things buried beneath the soil no one wanted to see. He stopped short of accusations, but he didn't stop haunting the property. Ray didn't understand that Belle thrived in silence. She had always been protected by it. And now, here was a man with nothing left to lose who spoke too loudly and stayed too long. He wasn't just a threat. He was becoming the match in her dry field. By the time March arrived, a silence had settled over the Helgelian household in South Dakota, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from absence. Azel Helgelian had not heard from his brother Andrew since January. Not a letter, not a postcard, not even a rumor of his whereabouts. For weeks, Azel had told himself it was nothing. Andrew had probably arrived safely, starting his new life with Belle Gunness, and simply lost track of time. But that story began to unravel when a family friend returned from Leaport and reported something strange. He had visited the Gunness farm and spoken briefly with Belle. She admitted Andrew had come to see her, but insisted he had stayed only a few days before leaving unexpectedly. She wasn't sure where he had gone, maybe to Chicago or to find a brother. She claimed he hadn't left a forwarding address and that he had simply walked away. Azel didn't believe it. He began searching Andrew's personal effects and found exactly what he'd feared. A stack of letters, all signed Belle Gunness, tied with twine and full of promises. She had begged Andrew to come quickly, to bring money and tell no one. She had described her loneliness in near poetic terms. She had written about her farm, her children, her hopes, and she had written again and again that he was the man that she waited for. If Andrew had truly changed his mind and left Belle, he would have written home. He would have told somebody. But there was nothing, not a word. Azel wrote to Belle directly, asking for clarity. Her reply was vague and evasive. She said Andrew had gone to Chicago, or maybe to Norway, or perhaps to look for work elsewhere. She claimed she didn't know, that he had asked her not to contact him, and that he preferred privacy. It was a story that said a lot without saying anything at all. Not satisfied, Azel wrote her again. He asked for Andrew's final letter, the last correspondence Belle claimed to have received. This time she deflected more forcefully. She accused Ray Lamphere of stealing the letter, calling him unstable and dangerous. She warned that he had a grudge against her and that he might harm her and that she feared for her life. It was a curious pivot. Azel had asked about Andrew and Belle had answered with a threat. And in doing so, she revealed more than she'd intended to. Now Azel was certain. Something had happened to his brother, and it had happened in that house. So now she got two men. They're driving her nuts.
So, but good on Azel for checking into things, man.
Yeah.
He's not letting her slide. Everybody else is letting her, like, oh, give her the benefit of the doubt. No, Azel's like, no, it's not, I know my brother, and something happened to him. I gotta go see what's going on.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, by early April, the once quiet whispers around Leaport had grown sharper, louder, and more public. Belle Gunness, who for years had evaded scrutiny with a combination of orderliness and silence, found herself being pulled into places where silence no longer offered protection. And the most dangerous of those places was a courtroom. April 15th, 1908. Belle sat just feet away from Ray Lamphere, the man she had accused of trespassing, harassment, and mental instability. Wasn't the first time she had filed charges, and it wouldn't be the last. But this hearing was different. It wasn't just about property disputes or unpaid wages. Ray's attorney had come prepared to dig deeper. The courtroom was modest, like many in Indiana towns, but the tension inside was thick. Onlookers leaned in and neighbors whispered. Belle, dressed in dark fabric and wearing her usual composure like armor, took the stand with practiced grace. She spoke clearly and directly, painting Ray as a threat. A volatile, jealous man who had grown obsessed with her. She claimed he had stolen letters, loitered on her property, and made threats against her life. All rehearsed so well. Ray's attorney, however, had questions for Belle she hadn't prepared for. Where is Jenny Olson, the young foster daughter who had disappeared in late 1906 and was allegedly sent to a finishing school in California? Why had no one seen her leave? Why no correspondence from Jenny has ever reached town? He pushed further, raising the names of Mad Sorensen and Peter Gunness, Belle's late husbands, both of whom had died under suspicious circumstances and were still clouded by speculation. Belle, for the first time in memory, faltered. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, but something shifted in her face just slightly as the rhythm of the questioning broke her routine. For years, Belle had existed just outside the reach of suspicion, shielded by careful image she had cultivated. But now, in the eyes of the court and the ears of the town, that image was beginning to crack. Ray didn't speak during the hearing. He didn't have to. The story being told was no longer about his trespasses. It was about a house where people disappeared, a woman whose life was filled with graves, and a question that no one had dared to ask out loud until that courtroom. What if Belle wasn't a victim at all? After the hearing, Belle was livid. Within days, she had Ray arrested again, this time over a petty charge tied to a missing tool and a long-standing grudge. But the arrest no longer carried the same weight. People were watching and they had heard too much. The courtroom had not convicted Belle of anything, but it had done something far more dangerous. It had broken her silence. And by the final week of April, Belle Gunness had lost control of the story. The town no longer viewed her as the resilient widow who had simply endured more than her fair share of misfortune. She was no longer protected by politeness or obscurity. Suspicion had seeped through the streets of Leaport like water into wood, and with every whispered name, Jenny Olson, Peter Gunness, Andrew Helgelian, that suspicion hardened into something heavier. Belle, ever watchful, sensed the shift. Her movements became more purposeful, her tone more urgent. She began confiding in townspeople, not with warmth, but with precision. To Cora McLaughlin, a clerk at the local dry goods store, she expressed fear. She said she believed Ray Lamphere was going to kill her. She claimed he was jealous, violent, and unhinged, and that she feared he would burn down the house with her and the children still inside. To neighbors, she repeated the same warning. Ray had threatened her, she said. He lingered near the farm, stared too long, and refused to let go, and she was afraid for her life. But there was something in the way she spoke, measured, almost rehearsed, that didn't sound like panic. It sounded like planning. On April 27th, 1908, Belle visited the office of J.W. Rudd, a Leaport attorney. She brought with her a calm resolve and instructions for a new last will and testament. In it, she left her estate to her surviving children. If they too were to perish by chance, together, the remainder would go to the Norwegians' orphans' home of Chicago. She signed the papers without delay. When asked by the change, she simply said, just in case something happens. Later that day, she visited the general store. She bought groceries, a few toys, and several pieces of candy. To the shopkeeper, it looked like a kind gesture, maybe a rare indulgence for her children. But she also purchased 2 full gallons of kerosene. The transaction wasn't questioned, as Belle was known to be practical, and she did heat her home with oil lamps after all. When she returned to the farm, she enlisted the help of Joseph Maxson, her young farmhand and live-in handyman, who carried the kerosene jugs into the house. Joseph was 21, new to the job, and unaware of the history he had stepped into. He didn't ask questions, and Belle didn't offer explanations, so the jugs were placed in the hallway. And that night, Belle moved through her home with eerie normalcy. She tucked the children into bed, Myrtle and Lucy, her daughters, still so young and unaware, and Philip, the youngest of them all. She passed through the rooms like she always had, lighting lamps, checking locks, keeping her eyes on the edges of the dark. But something had changed. The tension in her movements wasn't the tension of fear. It was the tension of finality. Belle had spent years building a life out of borrowed names and buried secrets. She had outlived husbands, lovers, and children. She had outmaneuvered neighbors, inspectors, and grieving families. But now, with the world collapsing in, she wasn't preparing to run. She was preparing to vanish. It was just past 4 a.m. when Ella Clifford shuffled into her kitchen on McClung Road, preparing to wake her husband for the day. As she reached for the coffee pot, her eyes drifted to the window. What she saw stopped her breath cold. The Gunness farmhouse was glowing, not with lamplight, but with fire. Angry, rising fire. Within minutes, the house was fully engulfed. Smoke poured through the roof, thick and curling, turning early spring air into something suffocating. Flames danced along the wood siding like they'd been waiting for this moment, tearing through the walls and windows with violent purpose. From the shadows, a figure stumbled forward, Joseph Maxson, barefoot, wild-eyed, coughing so hard he could barely speak. Sorry. He shouted for help, his words broken by smoke and panic. The family, he gasped, they're still inside. Just moments earlier, he had been asleep in his room at the back of the house when the choking started. The smoke came first, thick, suffocating, alive. He banged on the wall that separated his quarters from Belle's and the children's, yelling fire though the word barely made it out of his throat. He grabbed his overalls, a few belongings, and he ran out the back door down toward the carriage shed 50 feet away. He tried to return, but the house was already collapsing. Flames surged across the second floor, swallowing the roof. Maxson grabbed an axe and took it to the front door, splintering the wood with desperate blows. Just as he raised the blade again, the roof gave way with a cracking groan, caving in above the room he had just been sleeping in only minutes earlier. Ella had already woken her son William and sent him across the field. By the time he arrived, Maxson was still holding the axe. William was joined quickly by his father, Michael Clifford, and Uncle William Humphrey. Together, they asked where the bedrooms were. Maxon pointed to 2 upstairs windows. They retrieved a ladder and hurled bricks through the glass. Humphrey climbed up. First window, empty beds. Second window, the same. He considered climbing inside, but the fire roared louder now, and he knew he'd never make it out. He sent Michael to rouse the next farm over, calling for Daniel Hudson. By the time Hudson arrived, the house was no longer burning. It was consuming itself. With no other options, the men sent Joseph Maxon to ride into town for help. At 5 a.m., when he burst through the doors of the Leaport courthouse, frantic and smoke street. Sitting at the desk was Deputy Sheriff William Antis, who leapt into action. Together, they raced into the home of Sheriff Smutzer, just a few blocks away. When they returned to the Gunness farm, only 3 walls remained standing. The rest had collapsed into smoking ash. A crowd had already started to gather, and the volunteer fire company was called, but the blaze had already burned through its own fury. Pail after pail of water was tossed onto the wreckage, but it was little more than ceremony. At daybreak, as the flames surrendered to the morning air, Sheriff Smutzer and his men stepped forward. They found something strange, a pattern in the ruins. The fire had been hottest, most concentrated around the cellar door, as though it had been lit with intent. While whispers began to rise among the crowd, some said Belle had done it herself, desperate to escape a noose tightening around her, but others weren't so sure. Smutzer kept his thoughts quiet, but he acted quickly. He dispatched 2 deputies with orders: find and arrest Ray Lanfear. Then, shovel in hand, he turned to the ashes. He wasn't just looking for bodies, he was looking for answers. What they would uncover beneath the rubble would not only shatter Leaport, but etch Belle Gunness's name into history. And the digging was truly about to begin. And we will pick more up on the story next week with part 2.
What happened to the babies?
You have to find out next week.
You got to find out next week.
What happened to the babies?
You got to find out next week. I'm going to leave y'all with a cliffhanger. I don't get to leave y'all with a cliffhanger very much.
Oh
very
my God,
often.
that is
I'm
so
sorry.
cool.
I mean, she definitely put everything into place for all of the clues to point to him.
Yeah.
And I don't know, man. I'm excited to see what happens next week.
You're gonna next week is next week. I'm gonna wrap it all up. I'm gonna wrap up. Basically, I'm gonna focus on the years of the men coming in, what happened, how she did it, how many. So next year we're gonna get into the nitty gritty and somewhat gruesomeness. Next week, whatever. Next week, sorry.
It'll feel like a year for Shelley.
It'll feel like a year for Shelley.
I know.
Hey, listen, there's so much freaking information. Like the second part is probably just as long as this part, so I had to split it up. There's no way I could have done this all.
I promise.
I know everybody's like, damn it, Blake. I'm sorry. I know it's a rough cliffhanger, but it sounded like the perfect place to stop.
I promise, because you and I send each other our scripts. We don't read those scripts.
No.
That is there in case the other person can't go on.
Yeah.
I thought about skimming yours today, but I didn't do it. And I won't do it next week, but that's a bad spot to leave me.
Well,
yeah.
But you can see this woman is a master at leaving a breadcrumb trail for people to go where she wants them to go. She is a master manipulator. So
she very much is. Very much is. There is a lot that is revealed and that's going to be revealed in next week's episode. And you're going to find out what happened to everybody. When I say everybody, you're going to find out what happened to every single one of them. All the men, children, Belle herself. We're going to wrap it all up in a nice little bow, and I'm just going to hand it right over to y'all. So, I know it's a bad spot to leave all of y'all. I do. The comments are all just, damn it, Blake.
Well, then
love y'all.
I shall wait anxiously for my gift next week when you tie it up in a nice present with a nice bow. So Blake, with that, why don't you tell them everything you know? She ain't going to tell us nothing else.
We're not going to discuss it this week. We're going to discuss next week. We're laying the groundwork this week. Sounds good. All right. If you want to support the show directly, please don't be pissed at me for leaving you with such a wonderful cliffhanger this week. I thought it was a great place to stop. You can check out our Patreon page. That is going to be linked in our link tree tomorrow morning, Wednesday morning, on our Facebook and X profiles. For just $5 a month, you'll unlock over 450 exclusive Patreon exclusive videos. Bear with me, I read an entire script tonight, including the pre- and post-broadcast shows, which are the 30 minutes before and the 30 minutes after this live broadcast. Who knows, we might be discussing a little bit more about Belle. It also includes never before seen footage, including those famous dirty Estes methods and a couple of other of our adventures from around the country. So plus your support with this helps us to keep bringing you these wonderful cliffhangers week after week. If you're not sure about joining our Patreon, try it risk-free with our 7-day free trial. So make sure you stay connected with us. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and many more by searching Everything Vaguely Paranormal, looking for the green sound wave, or by clicking the icons in our link tree link. Remember, you can also catch us live every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on Facebook and YouTube. If you would like to meet us in person, you do have a few choices. May 30th through June 1st, this weekend, we will be in the DFW area for Fan Expo at the K. Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center, along with Mr. Chad Wandell from Ghost Geeks. Whoop, whoop. We will be there all weekend. Then next week, we are headed up to Chicagoland at the Countryside Banquet Conference Center in LaGrange, Illinois on June the 7th. Then in July, we will be at the Paranormal Rockdown at Broadhead Manor in Broadhead, Wisconsin. Shout out to Sir Sexy. I know he's watching tonight on July the 18th through the 19th. Then we are swinging across the country to head to Gettysburg Battlefield Bash from July 25th through the 27th in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Then we are off to Kansas City, middle of the country on August 2nd. Kansas City Paracon, sorry, on August 2nd in Kansas City. And then all the way out west to Vernal, Utah for Phenomicon 2025, September the 3rd through the 6th. And finally, we will be attending the Rock Island Roadhouse Esoteric Expo on October 4th in Rock Island, Illinois. So make sure you go to subscribe our Eventbrite page to be notified when our public investigation tickets go on sale. Yes, we do have more that are coming up. We currently only have, I believe, 5 more tickets left to the one we have on sale now, which is the Gregg County Historical Museum. We're the only way in because we have exclusive rights to that location. So if you've ever wanted to go check out our Eventbrite page and purchase your tickets. We are grateful for your continued support. Every like, comment, share, and download keeps the adventures alive. So if you have a favorite episode, share it with your friends. Make sure you tag us. And if you have a story, comment, or question, or you would like to have us as guests on your show, email us at theevppod@gmail.com. That is theevppod@gmail.com.
Go like, share, and subscribe to that YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Well, no discussion this week, guys. Sorry to kind of cut it so short, but we will be discussing next week. We want to thank you all for tuning in to another weekly episode of Everything Vaguely Paranormal. As always, for myself, I am Blake Smith, and my partners in the paranormal, Miss Shelley Pruitt, Mr. Ryan Roberts. Thanks for sticking with us, and as always, we will see you next Tuesday. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.